At that point, the two detectives searched the house, the Ramsey's house. It's kind of a deceiving house.
And then at this point, the camera sort of floats to the front door and it floats up through the house, and we see the ransom note, and then it concludes with this, showing the basement window wide open. Now you might say, what's misleading about that? Well, within the narrative structure of the episode, we've shown the basement window open at 7:30 a.m. That's on December 26th. You see this slide, look at this slide at 11 minutes. And then you see the open basement window at 12:36, less than 90 seconds later. And let me be quite plain. Without the basement window, they have no case. Without the basement window, there is no intruder theory, because they've got no point of entry. And let's also be clear, this is unforced entry, not forced entry. And then to reinforce my point, 1 minute later at 13:30 in the video timeline, well, it's 8 a.m. in the episode's timeline. So by inference, the documentary is implying the basement window was wide open all along from as early as 7:30 a.m. Is that accurate?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. So by inference, the documentary is implying the basement window was wide open all along from as early as 7:30 a.m. Is that accurate? Let's check, shall we? Let's check John Ramsey's first statement to the cops from April 30th, 1997. These are John's words. Actually, I'd gone down there earlier that morning into that room and the window was broken, but I didn't see any glass around, so I assumed it was broken last summer. I used that window to get into the house when, inaudible, I didn't have a key. This is the pertinent part. But the window was open about 1/8 of an inch. Not 8 inches, a fraction of an inch. And so he says he just kind of latched it, which suggests that he pushed it closed and latched it. And isn't that what the authorities saw? A closed window. Now, suddenly, with the creep of time and the swirl of memory down the drain of time, now suddenly the window's wide open. I thought it was open 1/8 of an inch. And you have a very similar narrative in the Madeleine McCann case, where there are descriptions about how many fractions and angles that a particular door is open and how the wind seems to magically pull it closed. Anyway, guess what? None of the authorities saw the basement window wide open at any time prior to mid-morning. And so a documentary presenting it that way clearly didn't even do basic research in this area. Now, don't you find it ironic? We are going to come and tell you the true story here. Well, maybe we could check a couple of facts and see whether that is the case. Now, in John's version of events, he says he went downstairs alone around mid-morning, found the window open, then closed it that morning. That's in their book. The book just says open, not wide open and not ajar. So if the cops were looking for a sign of entry, right, and that's what they were looking for, they were told JonBenet's been kidnapped, and so the cops went around the house looking for some kind of sign of that, forced entry or otherwise, but they couldn't find anything. And so did John tell them about the window? Steve Thomas also asked John about this. John, did you mention the open broken window to anyone? This is from that same interview in 1997. Steve Thomas says, and you mentioned when you went down in the morning, the 26th, and it was unlatched. Did that strike you as odd, or did you bring that to anybody's attention? John Ramsey, I don't know. I mean, I think it probably struck me as a little odd, but it wasn't. I mean, sometimes the window would be open because the basement got hot, or one of those windows would be opened. Okay, now, this is midwinter, so why are you talking about the basement getting hot? Usually when it's cold, you close windows. And do you notice that John doesn't answer the second part of that question? Did you bring that to anybody's attention? So is that a yes or a no? I mean, if the window was wide open and broken in the middle of winter, why didn't French, the first responding officer who went down to the basement, why didn't he not only see that the window's open, but feel the cold air? I think you would feel it that early in the morning on one of the coldest days of the year. It's the middle of winter. And if French was looking for a sign of entry, and John knew there was one, why didn't he tell French there and then? Because French doesn't mention it in his report. And when Arne talks about points of entry at the beginning of her report, she doesn't mention it either. As per French's report, a quick inspection of the interior of the house as well as talking to Mr. Ramsey, this is important, not only inspecting the house, the inside of it, but talking to John Ramsey indicated that there was no obvious signs of forced entry or struggle. Mr. Ramsey told me that the house appeared to be locked up as it had been left. Now, is a wide open window in the basement part of the house being locked up? Also, if it was wide open, why didn't Fleet White notice it? He also went down there. Didn't he feel cold winter air blowing into the basement from a wide open window? Why didn't Reichenbach, who scouted along the outside, or Officer Weiss, who took photos of the house, why didn't he notice anything? Why was it only noticed, only recorded, only mentioned, and only photographed by the authorities that night? And I think the part that is misleading is you've got a photo of the basement window, and it's obviously dark, and that implies it was taken that morning. And that is not the case. As far as I know, no photos were taken inside the house that morning. So I think Netflix blatantly showing the window wide open at this point, and this is quite early, this is in the first 15 minutes of the 3-part series, as if it was so clear and so obvious. Doing it this early in the timeline is, in my opinion, more than a little tricksy. Do you agree? Now, I'm sure you want me to move on from here, but I want to just hover on the subject a moment longer. While we're still dealing with the window area, someone made the comment that when Luther Stanton heard the sound of metal crashing on concrete, which makes a very distinct sound. If you've ever ridden a bicycle and fallen, you know what that sounds like. Someone suggested, could that have been the grate dropping down? Not a bad supposition, not a bad attempt at trying to connect a few dots. But as you can see from these images, the metal grate rests on metal, not concrete. And so if it fell down, it would have made a more metallic clanking noise. I also want to draw your attention to Lou Smith's hands as he reenacts the so-called intruder breaking into the house. Look at all the opportunities to leave either fingerprints, footprints, hand impressions, or even traces of fiber, what he's wearing. And these would necessarily include lifting the grate from the outside and then holding it up from the inside. Did they find any fingerprints or any trace of an intruder in this area? Well, not besides a single fingerprint from John. And that is a serious weakness to the intruder theory. In terms of this access point, what evidence is on and around the access point? The answer is nothing. There's no debris around it. There's no glass either. That brings us to number 3. The bed had been slept in, obviously.
I went upstairs, looked at JonBenet's bedroom. The bed wasn't made. It had been slept in, obviously.
To me, that bed doesn't look slept in. Where's the pillow? And incidentally, I have a similar assessment of Madeleine McCann's bed. It doesn't look slept in to me. Now let's look at something else that's typically left out of the dog-eared Ramsey narrative. And that brings us to the penultimate point, number 4. Keep your children close to you. Almost everyone familiar with the Ramsey case ought to be familiar with this. We've all seen Patsy doing her spiel about keep your babies close to you on CNN. And guess what? Episode 1 takes its name out of this dramatic moment.
I will tell my friends to keep your babies close to you. There's someone out there.
Now let's look at the same clip again, and this time keep your eye on John and John's lips as Patsy says, keep your children close to you. doesn't he seem to be mouthing the exact same words just as Patsy's saying them?
She, but if I were a resident of Boulder, I will tell my friends to keep your babies close to you. There's someone out there.
Now, why doesn't the director Joe Berlinger show this clip? Or are we imagining things? Let's watch it again in slow motion.
Your baby close to you.
Number 5, Orchestrated. If we go to JonBenet's America, which came out way back in 1998, Penny Buffe, presumably Dr. Buffe's spouse, someone who seemed to be a strong supporter of Patsy's and an ardent churchgoer, she says they, the congregants, decided at the memorial service to create a cordon in order to protect the Ramseys from the media.
However, during the service, their minister had suggested to the congregation that they should line the pavement as a gesture of support.
We were wanting to protect them because they had been through so much grief already, and we felt that this wasn't the time or the place, and so the congregation basically just tried to shield them from that sort of thing. And
now, let me ask you a question. Was this sort of shielding taking place right in the beginning where several of the Ramsey friends, the Fernies, the Whites, and a reverend arrived very early on the morning of December 26th? Yes or no? Was there shielding later that night when the officers arrived at the Fernies to talk to the Ramseys, only to find John's brother Jeff there and several other individuals, including attorneys present, as well as the doctor? Was there shielding at this memorial service? Were the lawyers and the PR a kind of shielding? Was the ransom note a kind of shielding? Now, on Netflix, Carol McKinley describes this moment when the Ramseys emerged out of church as a sort of first and only moment that Boulderites had any kind of access to the Ramseys after the incident. And if I remember correctly, the media were invited to the event but simultaneously held at arm's length. We want you to see us in this context, but it's kind of like, look but don't touch. Doesn't that seem orchestrated to you? It's also very interesting the role that the church, in the McCann case, the Catholic Church, where they actually went and met the Pope, played in that case. And that's not the only time that the church comes into that story. And it's also at this point that McKinley notes how there was another barrier between the Ramseys and the media. She's a reporter. She wants to interview them. And only to find that there's a publicist who's handling all the inquiries very early on. And so we see Netflix providing this article. Publicist doesn't know when or if Ramseys will talk. And did they ever talk? Were they ever freely giving interviews to sort of random reporters? Or did they handpick who they would give interviews to? It's also interesting how Netflix seems to have blurred out 90% of this article. So what do you think? Were the Ramseys hiding behind lawyers and PR 28 years ago? And if not lawyers and PR, then friends of theirs? And is it possible that the Ramseys were hiding behind a ransom note?
Speak to John and Patsy Ramsey, I tell them to quit hiding behind their attorneys, quit hiding behind their PR firm, come back to Colorado, work with us to find the killers in this case, no matter where that trail may lead.
And do you remember this commitment John and Patsy made on CNN on New Year's Day, January 1st, 1997?
We will sit down with the police, absolutely. Absolutely. We want them to know everything possible.
Everything. Whatever they want, whatever anyone wants, we will cooperate.
And so, did the Ramseys cooperate? First of all, JonBenet's body was now not even in Boulder. It was buried in Atlanta. And later on, the police actually wanted to exhume the body because they wanted to check something, but the body wasn't even in Boulder anymore. The other thing is that the Ramseys themselves weren't even in Boulder. They were in Atlanta. So you literally had the police having to fly to another city in order to speak to the Ramseys and in order to conduct the investigation. And remember what we said in the previous analysis about Fleet White being so upset that the Ramseys were going on CNN, not going back to Boulder and dealing with this case. Was that ire justified? And I think it's a fair question to say, if you ask the question, were the Ramseys hiding behind lawyers and PR 28 years ago? Are they still doing the same thing today? Anyway, let me know in the comments if you'd prefer me to continue examining the other 2 episodes on Netflix, or if you'd rather I return to Ashley Flower's interview with JonBenet's father. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.